All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome. It is time for a LinkedIn Live with Integrates, our monthly lives. This is where every month we kind of go through a facet of trauma-informed decision-making and communication. Okay. And this week we're talking more about, or this month we're talking more about breaking down a trauma-informed decision. Okay. And last month, was it last month or in February? Yeah, it was last month. Sarah and I really broke down our framework that we use, our integrates trauma informed decision making framework, and what that is at each step. Okay. Now today we're going to go a little deeper, and we're going to talk about the ethical side of um, of making a trauma informed decision and the ethics around it. Okay. And Laura Miller here is our guest, and she is an ethicist through and through. You focus on AI, but I mean, really, at the end of the day, you can bring ethics in anything.
It's absolutely able to be applied to anything and everything, for sure.
So, can you talk a little bit about your work before we start into talking about this concept of a minefield versus a minefield, which would be like trenches, and we'll go through that. But first, let's talk a little bit about you and your background and kind of how you see trauma informed care and ethics working together.
Sure. So my name is Laura Miller, and I am an AI ethicist, but I like to say that I'm an ethics first ethicist. Now, ethics is studied under philosophy. And when we look at that, we start really looking at our world and asking some of those big questions that most people don't think have any answers. But really, what we're doing is we're looking to unpack those most difficult questions to see if we can get to an answer and what that answer might be and what some objections to it might be and how it all works. So we're the quintessential, kind of young mind that wants to understand why, not just why something is, but why it has to be that way, or if it has to be that way. And if it, weren't the way that it is, what might it be like instead? So I unpack those kinds of problems. I can do it and have done it in society, in work, and helping the houseless. I've done it in AI innovation, where I've looked at frameworks to guide ethical AI and asked if they're robust enough, cover enough, and even if just one framework is enough. So again, it's looking at how the status quo works and then figuring out why it works that way and how it might work better. Now, when we're talking about trauma informed care, we're definitely talking about better ways to approach people. And we're talking about the fundamental ideas of philosophy and ethics, which is what is good, right, fair, and just for the person in the situation that we're meeting in that moment where their trauma is full force, noticeable to you, even if it's not noticeable to them, or sometimes noticeable to them, even if it's not transparent to you. But usually you recognize it because of strong emotions, conflict, knee-jerk reactions, and a lot of shutting down, or the exact opposite, which is aggression, and trying to deal with all of those complicated feelings and emotions, especially when they collide. Because when you're dealing with things like ethics and you're dealing with things like what matter to people and what's good and what's fair and what's best and what's right, well, sometimes what's best for you isn't what's best for someone else, and what's best for them isn't necessarily best for a third person. And you can really get sandwiched in between trying to work out what is the best thing to do when you have to make a choice, and none of the choices are easy, and none of the situations are entirely transparent, and emotions are high. So it deals with conflict, it deals with change, it deals with culture, and it deals with a deep questioning of ourselves, our motivations, and how we're really going to approach this. So with that, I'll turn it back to Julie and see where she wants to take us next.
And yeah, because before we went live here, I was just talking. I said, because I work in the world of technology, of tech, mostly, instructional learning experience design and coaching within the tech world, and also the wellness world a little bit, and each space we kind of look at it a little bit differently. But the one thing that is not talked about that circles any role I'm in is we can all sit and talk about, advocate for trauma-informed care, these things, but what it takes to be in the headspace to do it is either a mind it's either a transparent mindful field or it is a minefield, and sometimes it can be both, let's be honest, but like
Both usually.
it's like sometimes it can be a little bit of both.
Yeah, most often both.
Yeah. And so because when you and it's really starting to get into the nuance of what that means, and so when we start talking about it being a mind, using our minds through it, really what we're talking about is moving into those spaces of using those human-centered communication styles and making and using the decision-making frameworks that many of us use, depending on who you're talking to. There's like 4 we use in our trainings. There's one that we are in the process of copywriting, which is the one we did last month. It's taking you through a process where really all we're doing is trying to minimize the amount of harm that could be done. At the end of the day, trauma-informed decision making is harm reduction.
Yeah.
And that's that's what it comes down to. And so can you speak a little bit more about, from an ethics standpoint, what does harm reduction mean from an ethical perspective?
From an ethical perspective, harm reduction would be trying to navigate the best outcome across outcomes. In other words, it's really looking at it's nuanced, because in some situations you are really going to have to lean in depending on the harm or the trauma that's involved. You're going to have to lean into one particular solution, but that leaning into one means leaning out of another. So you have to be very, very mindful of exactly where you are in that scenario and how much you lean in which way, because a lot of the times what you're looking for is the best solution for the situation while not making another situation occur, because you can resolve one trauma and trigger another, and you can have a domino of trauma go through your team, go through your department, go through an organization, where it dominoes one into the other, and the more people that get tripped up, especially over a solution, like, the greater your problem will become rather than minimizing it. So one of the things that we have to do with ethics is we really have to look at it from multi sides and really recognize and take the time to invest our mind into these solutions to try to figure out exactly who is impacted. Is it only the person in front of me? Because making a decision, like, you can make a choice about only the person in front of you, knowing they're part of a team or a group and not expecting it to bounce around the group, is highly impractical and unlikely. So when we talk about harm from an ethical perspective, we're talking about harms, plural.
Right.
We're looking at all the places that we can find it, all the places we might make it work worse, and the ways in which maybe we could even come up with an intervention that would be mutually reinforcing for others instead of mutually harmful for others. But that does mean we have to slow down a little bit. It does mean we have to be thoughtful about it. It does mean that we have to really consider the situation that someone has allowed to become transparent and look at the situations that are annexed to it and the other people's feelings that are attached to those different situations that you're trying to tackle and help someone through. Because part of harm reduction is that the people that you're helping really feel like you're helping and that you're at least trying. Because one of the things that's the hardest about harm reduction is it's incredibly difficult to get it done in such a way that everybody thinks you nailed it.
Yeah.
There are going to be feelings about that. There are going to be people who are going to be disappointed. There are going to be people who think you could have done more. There are going to be people, but if you can explain it, if you've thought it through, you'll be able to answer those kinds of challenges and those kinds of questions and be able to help broaden the perspective of others who maybe didn't see those annexed situations the way that you did, to understand, like, that's why they did that. Because it's just never as simple. Sometimes it's so simple you miss it. And sometimes it's so complicated that your only choice is to treat it as though it's simple. So you can't leave your mind out of this and have any hope of getting anywhere near where you need to be.
Absolutely. And I think that you brought up a really good point. And especially, I mean, I've lived in it. I mean, I feel like you and I go out for coffee on a weekly basis to help balance all the different decisions I have to make in this doing this work, and I think you brought up what's not is the harms that are that come in, right? The harms that the domino effects, right?
Yes.
And that it's not just like, oh, harm reduction, oh, and I think that that's where some of the aspects of the discussion around some of these things aren't always like, we don't always go into the nuance of all the things that move into it. And I like how you talked about that it's the ricochet, right? And that someone and the emotions around it is
Yes.
that you're going to be like, yes, I did this awesome thing. And then you're going to have like 5 people, at least in my position, and people are like, yeah.
Can we talk about that? I'm not really sure I'm comfortable with how that worked out. Yeah, I don't know, and then you're like, wait a minute, but like, I thought of everything. I like hit it out of the park. But one of the things you have to do as you go through this is, and I talk about this a lot in ethics, I try not to repeat myself. I'm horrible at that. I do. But you have to be transparent. The more you can explain to people what went into a decision, the better they're able to understand how you got there. And then they might say, well, maybe next time think about this, instead of like, and they don't really have anything to say, but it doesn't sit right.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know how to respond to it because they're not giving you anything to work with.
Right.
But if you know what your process was, and you know what you did to get through it, and you know what you did to arrive at where you did, well, now you have meeting grounds or potential meeting grounds to have those conversations to, well, number one, understand if maybe you did not get it right. Maybe you didn't hit it out of the park as best as you thought you did. It is possible you even got it wrong, but you won't know where you went wrong if you aren't able to give people reasons who can then point out to you, oh, you missed this one. And similarly, if the other person missed one, you have to be able to give them your reasons for them to go, I missed half of that.
Yeah.
Because without that kind of transparency, you lose trust and you lose opportunity to figure out how to do it better when the next opportunity comes up.
But you brought up the right point about those transparent. I mean, what we are going to do here towards the end here is the having those transparent processes, right? That's where trust and safety,
Yes.
those security things we talk so much about, which isn't, I know, a sub area you work in, but you have transparent policies and frameworks that you
Yes.
work through. So because it's not an if, it's a when someone sits in front of you and said, how did you come to that decision? It's never because I felt like it,
No,
because
that's not an answer.
well, and that's a thing, that we really have to look at, because, I mean, that's why, at least on Integrate, why we have such a really strong process, and we have like a question and a policy, I feel like, for almost everything, and not everything, but like lots of things, in terms of how we do what we do and why we do what we do, because so much of it's so nuanced, that someone, like what I always say is someone can just be triggered and be like, well, that person is not trauma informed because they triggered me. Well, not necessarily,
Not necessarily.
not necessarily, it can be it can feel so subjective and personal, and that's where those frameworks, those decision-making frameworks, that do harm reduction are so important in any team or business space, right? And just knowing, that's why I love peer coaching. Peer coaching comes from, rooted in, at least my background is rooted in the world of recovery, so, and I love how they teach you every framework that we do is transparent. There are no secrets. No
Well,
one
I was
is.
going to say AI and tech. I mean, especially in the AI where we are now, ethicists, because we like policy, we like process, we like to understand how things work. Remember, that was part of the introduction. So what you'll hear about is the NIST AI RMF framework. We're literally putting frameworks around it to try to get our hands around it, to try to figure out what to do. So this idea where chaos reigns, policy, process, transparency, and really having a reciprocal open arrangement and relationship to be able to really get into the nitty-gritty of this to find out what's going to work for your team, your scenario, or your situation is incredibly important. And being willing to change it up as you step from one team into another is essential, because what works for one group of people will not always work for another. And you have to recognize that the trauma that one group brings might be different than a trauma that another group brings. I mean, I teach classes with roughly 30 students per class, 3 to 4 a semester. That's 120 students in 4 cohorts of 30. Semester after semester after semester. I can't treat all classes like they're the same. They're not. And neither are my students. And what they make when they come together is unique and distinct as well. It's almost like each cohort, each group maintains and becomes its own identity. And you have to speak to that. And you have to have the skills that are transferable enough that when you get dropped into another group, that you have those skills and those frameworks and those processes and decision-making tools that you're going to discuss towards the end, that you have those and you can reapply them and know how and make them work. Not just know what they are, but have them be successful across multiple spectrums.
Absolutely. I think you're 100%. No, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think you make a good point with the AI piece too, in the minefield, going into the minefield. That's a really good minefield. Is when do you see people moving into that space of mindfulness? We're transparent, we're clear, we have these frameworks, the why, into minefields, into the trenches, into what we call where the emotional traps are there, the manipulation, the gaslighting starts to go. Where do you see that? Definitely in ethics, but like, where do you see that shift move from mindful to, oh, we're in a minefield, no one's going to win here, we're all going to lose because we're all triggered and emotional?
As I say, usually what lets me know that things have gone seriously awry are different things. Conflict is one, but it's not always just conflict. Not everyone is super vocal or in your face, but generally what you start hearing is a lot of pushback, a lot of disagreement, or you'll start getting stronger vocabulary words, even if somebody's saying them completely politely. But you'll start recognizing that those emotions and those tensions start to go up, and you'll realize that you're standing, usually it's, if we use the term, minefield, it's usually right about when you're about to put your foot down on something very dramatic, that you start kind of getting your spidey senses going, letting you know, like, they're not with me on this, or I lost them along the way, or the vocabulary is shifted, or the challenges that I'm getting are off topic, or introducing new things. Because usually when you lose control of it, you've lost control of it. That means that something happened and shifted in the way that you were working with others, that they started shifting how they were responding to you too. So when you start seeing team dysfunction, when you start seeing disagreement, when you start getting pushback, when you state something simply and then you get 48 questions, you've kind of lost that trust. Something shifted within that dynamic that you didn't catch in time. So for me, for a lot of it, I both question everyone nodding, the constant, whatever you say is great is not likely the case. But also if I start noticing oh yeah, I'll get right on that too, I might be busy, or, well, I don't know if that really fits with what I saw, or you start getting those kinds of things, you have to feel the resistance.
Right.
And I really think that when I start hitting the resistance, instead of like smoothly going along, and then all of a sudden you're like,
yeah.
Then you're like, okay, where'd the resistance come from? And most likely it's not going to be one of the people that you're working with. Most likely you shifted something and now others are recognizing it. Now you've got to figure out how to shift them with you.
Right.
Or if you shifted when you shouldn't have.
Right.
And there is always this, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, there's always, especially with ethics, there's always this element of introspection, of questioning yourself, of doubting yourself, of considering if you've gotten it wrong. It's a very, very humbling place to be. Right. But you can't do it if you don't look in the mirror.
Right. Totally.
you have to at least know if it's you and
Yeah.
what you can control and what you can affect, and what is I need to bring the others with me because I think I am in the right place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, I think you talked about when you hit the resistance, because I think like me and Sarah talked about lots of times, like that's where in like step 3 of our framework, where you have to finding agency, we had this whole process we like went through, is that's where that's where I usually go to of like, okay, how can we give people space to feel free to think what they're going to think, and without feeling um going into our real minefields, going to, where the or the what's it called, the I forgot what the institute that does all the research on marriages, Gottman Institute, calls
Right.
the four horsemen of the apocalypse,
Mhm.
which is like
Yes.
all of the gaslighting,
Yes.
all the toxic behaviors we see, is giving people, it's almost like that's in step 3. You would say, you're free, you're free to, have whatever feelings you need, about it, because I think sometimes that's where the resistance comes in, is I don't agree with this. I'm having some resistance towards what they're saying. Oh, something's wrong. You see what I'm
Mhm.
saying? And that's where I think it's not that something is wrong or you disagree. I think that we have such an agreeable workforce because we move into agreeability, that if we have resistance, we don't know why we have resistance, but we think that resistance is the wrong. And
Right.
then defenses begin.
Yes. Yes, they do. And I think sometimes, look, you really have to know your people and you have to know your team. You have to know when you need to give someone time to kind of process and kind of figure out for themselves where they're really at so that they can answer some substantive questions to help you all get past that resistance. But
Right.
then there also needs to be times, and, I'm sure that there's going to be some people looking into, um, who are leading, who are like, okay, but at some point I have to lead. I can't just sit around and let, everybody just, like, how long do I give them to ruminate, that kind of a thing. And I think it's one of those things that you have to be the kind of leader where you give grace and time where you can,
Mhm.
and that you recognize that there are times where you won't be able to give as much. But one of the things that can help people the most is consistency in leadership. And we talk about this a lot in ethics, where it's most helpful to the people that you are involved with and that you have relationships with, even as friends, cohorts, peers, as leaders, managers, employees. Being consistent is one of the simplest, well, it's not simple. The concept is simple, which is be consistent. Being consistent in choice and actions and deeds and responses is far more difficult. But the
Mhm.
closer that you can get to people being able to predict accurately how you will react in a situation, when you will say we have to move forward, when you will say you can have some time to adapt or adjust or get back to me with that, the more you can be consistent in that, the more effective your teams will be, and the more opportunities you'll have for people to feel like they can come to you, to feel like the door is open and actually have it be open, and the more they kind of know what they're going to get from you in response. But that kind of predictability lends itself to safety, and safety lends itself to openness, which also lends itself to processing these things in real time in a more transparent way that gets us past the resistance faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked how you talk about maintaining leadership, because lots of times what I hear that we don't often see practiced in trauma informed care, especially in, um, and I'll speak from what I know, which is when I was instructionally coaching quite a bit, is there's always a question of where does authority meet hierarchy?
Yes.
Okay. All the time. Whenever I was coaching in the school system, it was always that. And I see that in businesses too, is we tend to shift back into more of this very passive way of being. And
Yes.
I like how you talked about consistency
Yes.
is safe, is a way to get to safety, right? And being consistent in how you make the behaviors,
Yeah.
right? Or sorry, make the decisions.
Yes.
Like, I know, I can, for most part, people I've worked under that have feel safe, at least to me, they may not be the decisions I make, but I at least know how they're going to make a decision. And okay, it's not great, but like that
You
in
can
this space
anticipate it.
is
Right.
I can anticipate it. I start to feel real funky when I start to see people make decisions all over the map. And
Right.
that to me starts to stay, kind of abort. How do I need to get out of here? Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it doesn't it when you never know how someone is going to react, you're less likely to bring something to them because you don't know how they're going to react. If you don't understand how they make decisions and you haven't been transparent about how you make decisions, so nobody knows how you're making them, it doesn't feel right to trust you with them. So that's when you start finding employees not using open door policies or slinking away from your open door or being very quiet in meetings. I always tell, my students when I'm teaching them, because like I said, I've got like groups of 30. My favorite room is a noisy one. It really is. Because if people are being quiet and keeping their feelings down on the down low and all of that, they're not being candid. They're not in the moment. So what I like it is when people, kind of swing by my door and, stick their head in and wonder what class has students, really weighing in on their opinions, and then watching the actual shock and awe on their face when they realize it's a philosophy class and the students are all in, because it's hard to imagine, ancient Greeks and Socrates and the students being like, yeah, man. But you know what? When you can get to the point that you're not going to team meetings that are crickets, when you can get to the point where people are willing to stop by and be like, hey, I had a rogue thought. Here's this weird thing that crossed my mind. I don't know what to do with it, but here you go.
Right.
That's when you're doing it in a way that's going to be effective for the group that you're in. If you're still facing crickets and quiet and silence and nobody has anything to say and everything's great or it's quiet, you're already in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we slip into compliance,
You
right?
do. Everybody does. Yeah.
Yeah, we slip into compliance, and that's always a threat response. Even if you're a great leader, it's always the threat of it, right? The threat of I need to be compliant because I need to sense threat for a little while. I need to, it's a survival mechanism.
Right.
Okay, so last thing. Okay, so we just kind of talked through a trauma-informed choice. The difference between how we're mindful in it, using frameworks, letting your teams know what your
Mhm.
decision frameworks are. Even what I do when I'm doing, especially a lot of peer coaching, is I bring those frameworks in and we work through the process together and within ourselves by ourselves. Okay. And then, that way people are always aware of how we make decisions. That's why we have a vetting process that's very open and transparent, in our community. It's why if anyone asks a question, I have a link for them. I feel like I've got a link for many questions. Um, and then we moved into the minefields and we talked about, kind of the four horsemen of the communication apocalypse that gets us there, and how we get there and also leading through that, right?
Right.
Where do you feel like in terms of where do you feel like what are like the key things, like anyone that is self-leading, which is anybody breathing that wants to do good in the world,
Right.
what do you think are the maybe one or two, maybe three attributes, skills people need in order to work through those processes?
Um, One of them is going to be humility. One of the things that we didn't get into, but I'd look forward to in future talks, are the trauma that leaders carry with them that can get triggered, that can interrupt this process, because leaders can shut down as much as anyone else and kind of fall into complacency as well.
Well, that brings us into the other thing that we can talk through. This is like a whole second process, but I had a feeling we were going to go there is, what do they call it? Moral injury. The
Yeah,
moral injury.
absolutely.
That's
So I
that's
think,
real talk.
yeah, so I think to do this work, you really need a humble sense of self. Like I said, talked about that you've needed to consider that you could be wrong. I've asked you to be transparent about how you make choices and what drives your choices so people can better understand them. I've asked you to be willing to have an open door in a different way than maybe you thought an open door worked.
Hold on,
That
sorry.
you open the door.
Keep going. Sorry, everything is going off. Sorry about
I was
that.
gonna say, where you don't necessarily just open up your door and hope people will show up, but an open door policy where people are tempted to stop by and where they want to. So you need a healthy dose of humility. The second thing that you really need, and look, it's touted in every job ad known to man, but it's specifically the wheelhouse of critical thinking, not only about what other people are doing, but what you're doing and how all of that fits into the bigger picture. Because ideas, thoughts, and decisions are not made in a vacuum. They're all interconnected and they're all going to pull in different areas that may be planned, unexpected, unintended, or intentional. So the more intentional about that we can be and the more we can think critically, the better off we'll all be. And the third one, if we're going to speak to mindfulness and we're going to talk about being trauma informed, is what I would call genuine empathy. Not, I'm just listening to you because I'm supposed to listen to you. And yes, I know I need to take your feelings into consideration. But you should really, really like the people that you work with. You should be invested in them. You should be invested in your teams and the work that you're doing so that you're wholly engaged and motivated to do this work, because it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard trying to constantly focus on, I have to think deeply about this. Now I have to unpack that. Now I have to figure out how this works. Now that can wear you down. But when you legitimately are engaged, when you care about the people that are involved, when you really want to see a better impact because your heart is in it, not just because it's what you're supposed to do, you'll find things change very quickly. The best of intentions means you're closer to getting the best of things. If your heart isn't the right place, if you're not doing things for the right reasons, it's going to be very, very difficult to get the best results or the outcome that the people need, or to even make the tough calls where you have to disappoint people or let someone down, which may be the case. But if they know that you care about them and they know that you're in it with them and they know that you struggled with the choice and you still didn't have anything you could do, but not make it as far or not make the full choice they wished you would have, it comes much easier from someone with a genuine heart, with good intentions, looking out for you.
Excellent. That's great. Part 2 of this will be moral injury.
I think we need that one.
I think we need to talk, especially as we get through like the political season. We need to bring up moral injury because I think that that's something that's really, really, really impactful right now. I think 200%.
I think it would be extremely beneficial for everyone to really give that some serious thought, because there's one thing that we're learning in our world these days is escaping harm, whether you're a teenager on social media who gets an algorithm that just says, here's more harm for you, or whether you're working in a non-supportive work environment, or whether you're struggling with work-life balance, or whether you have the real world showing up at home, whether it's through illness, injury, death, or just the hard stuff, inflation, meeting bills, politics, all of those things. Escaping harm is next to impossible. So we need the skills to be able to figure out what to do with it when it appears, especially when it appears en masse, all at once, consistently, on a never-ending, what seems to be a never-ending repeat. We need to figure out where resilience comes from. And you can't get to resilience if you can't understand harm, how it works, the tools to move past it, get past it, find a better place, get some stability, get your feet underneath you, and meet the next day.
Absolutely. 200%. Yes. And I think you hit a really noted point on the end, is that, you're not going to escape harm, and that, and learning to have you know, and learning how to measure those and feel and be discerning in that is really, I think, our work right now in the world, for sure. Especially, I think that that's a big part of the work we're doing in this part of history right now too. Is this, you know, is how do we deal with the moral injury of that's happening around us, you know?
And
Very
it's happening everywhere across the globe, from wars, plural, to, like I said, financial worries, to job worries, to work from home worries, to worries about family, to children who missed years due to COVID, to people who are still struggling with symptoms or side effects, to the people that we've lost, the people we didn't see, the people we said goodbye to.
right,
Our life is quite full
right,
and not necessarily of the good stuff.
yeah,
So, in order to get back to it, we have to find a way through it. So,
yeah,
we have to find a way through the not good to get to the good.
right. Write that down in our chat
Yeah.
to get through the not good.
If we want to find the good. So, we need to start scratching at it and figuring that out.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, and that's what they always say, you know, we always say is you know, you have to, you know, you can't go around it, you have to go through it, you know, says every therapist I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So
Yes, whether it's your own or others or attached to you or it just shows up vicariously, you know, it once, you know, I've always said that once something finds you, it's meant for you, meaning there's some lesson in it for you. There's something for you to do with it. There's a reason why it showed up on your radar.
right.
So can you meet that moment? And that's what I think trauma-informed skills do. That's what I think ethics does. That's what I think, that's where I think we put the good and the not good on a collision course and kind of, you know, dare it to stand down to the good.
Yeah. That's a good it almost sometimes feels like oh, it feels like a labyrinth. That labyrinth thing from like the 80s. I don't know if you ever like what you
Yeah,
put the marble in it and you just that's kind of what this whole thing is like. It's like
it
getting
does.
keeping the marble up, you know, knowing that it'll fall somewhere, but you're just trying to keep it up for as long as it can.
For as long as you can before it lands someplace. And then hopefully when it lands someplace, it's not the worst place it could land.
Right. Right.
Maybe it's closer to the best place, even if it doesn't quite get there.
Exactly.
Mhm.
That's how I feel whenever I have to move into make any decision in any leadership position I've ever been in. So, well, thank you so much for this. And yeah, and people can find you. What's your just on your on LinkedIn at Laura Miller?
It should be Elma or ethicist.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's Laura. Yes, yes, yes. Laura Ethicist. Yes, and that's your website, right? .com.
Yeah, the website is
Yeah.
nextgenethics.com.
Okay.
And my LinkedIn should be L Miller, ethicist on LinkedIn.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. That was a great conversation. I appreciate it. All right. So we will end the stream. Thank you, everybody.